Hi there, and welcome back to Speak English with Christina, where you'll learn American culture and business know-how to become more confident in English. And today we have our second special lesson, how to introduce yourself naturally and with confidence. And before we start, go ahead and activate the subtitles for this video if you want the subtitles. And this episode is part of the free mini course, Confident Conversation Skills, Small Talk Strategies for Big Success. And if you want to be sure to get all of the lessons in this series, go ahead and sign up at ChristinaRobofe.com and you'll become part of our community of 35,000 plus Speak English ambassadors, students who are learning with me. So today we're going to dive right into part 2, which is all about natural, confident introductions for great first impressions when you're making conversation, when you're making small talk, and it can be in both professional and personal situations. Now, the first thing is I want to share with you a typical introduction that I hear from students. Now, this is not to make fun of students, but just to show you what I typically hear and what is wrong with this. So I might ask, a student, say like, oh, tell me about yourself, or, I don't know if we've met yet. And the student will start this like presentation of themselves. And it's often like, hi, I'm Jose. I'm 44 years old. I'm a computer engineer. I have a son. He's 13 years old. I'm married. I'm from Madrid. I work in my company for 9 years. That's all. And then I hear this and I'm like, I know you can do better than this. But like I said, it's not to make fun of the students, but it's just to show this is what typically happens. And it's not exactly what is expected in a conversation when you're introducing yourself. So in this lesson, we're going to transform the way that you introduce yourself. We're going to look at key vocabulary on how to naturally talk about your job. We're going to look at a conversation strategy, which I call ping pong conversations, and you'll see why when we get to that part. We'll do a little zoom on a specific aspect of spoken English, which is the word basically. And then we'll also look at some cultural insights about Americans and the idea of awkward silence. So, key vocabulary. How can you talk about your job in a very natural way? The first thing is just to go ahead and break the ice, to have that first contact with the person. And you can just approach them and say, hi, I'm Christina, or your first name. Hi, I'm Christina. I don't think we've met. And then you just, introduce yourself and start a conversation. Or, nice to meet you. So what do you do exactly? And talking about your job and what you do is just a very easy, neutral topic that you can use to start a conversation. Now, if you're a little afraid, or if you lack a little confidence about conversations like small talk, it's always a good idea to have an answer prepared to the questions that people almost always ask, like, what do you do? And this question basically is, what is your job? But it's a more natural way. This is what you'll hear most often. So what do you do? Or what do you do for a living? Means what's your job? Now, you can start with your company. I work at or I work for. It's basically the same thing. I work for Google. I work at Google. Easy enough. Then you could talk about your department or your sector with I work in. Like I work in the marketing department, or I work in telecommunications, or I work in pharmaceuticals. And of course, you can combine them for like a double whammy. I work for Patagonia, so for the company, in R&D, in the department. So that's research and development. Or I work at Apple in HR, and that's human resources, of course. Maybe you want to talk about how long you've been at your company or in your job. And for this, we're going to use the present perfect tenses and since and for. So you might say like, I've been there for plus the duration. So for is plus period or duration. I've been there for 7 years. Or I've been with them since, and then the point in time. So I've been with them since 2012. To talk about your activities, the expression I'm in charge of. So with a noun, I'm in charge of the development of sustainable materials. Or a verb plus ing, I'm in charge of creating training programs. That's a very good expression to have, and you can use it in those two different ways. You might talk about the activities that you do. So part of my work involves verb plus ing. So part of my work involves testing our products in the mountains, or part of my work involves training new employees for our Apple stores. And before we move on to the next part, which is conversation strategy, I suggest that you go back, review those expressions, make some notes for yourself, and see how you would use those expressions to describe your job and to talk about your career, so that you always have that answer and you have, something prepared to talk about you and your job. And again, you don't want to give a presentation about you and your job, but you're going to use it in a ping pong conversation. So, good conversation, it's like ping pong. The ball is the words, let's say, and you pass, the ball back and forth between you and your conversation partner. No one dominates, no one makes a presentation, you go back and forth. So just an example of that. Here you've got a short conversation between two people, and you'll see how it goes back and forth. Like, I don't think we've met. I'm Lisa. Nice to meet you. I'm Colin. So what do you do exactly, Colin? Oh, I work in R&D at Patagonia, the outdoor gear company. Yeah, I love your clothes. Yeah, thanks. Me too. And not just because I work there. So what about you? What do you do? And you see that conversation goes back and forth. Now, I wish I had someone here to record that conversation with me, but you get the idea. Now, a good idea in a ping pong conversation is, of course, to ask questions about the other person, like their job, so what do you do exactly? Their work history, and how long have you been doing that with that present perfect continuous tense? You can ask about their professional interests, like how did you get into your field? And this means like how did you start your job in your field? So how did you get into programming? Do you like computers? Try to learn a little bit about the other person. Everybody likes, someone to take interest in them. You can ask about their start in their current company. Like, so how did you get started at Google? And to get started at, that just means how did you start at your company? So for example, how did you get started at Google? I heard it's hard to get hired there. And here's another example of just how smooth the conversation will flow when you have these ping pong conversations. So again, I'm going to read both roles here. So what about you? What do you do? Oh, I actually have my own cosmetics company, so I do a little bit of everything, basically. Oh, wow. How long have you had your company? About 4 years now, but I've worked in cosmetics for 14 years. I used to work at Body Shop. Oh, and how did you get started with your own company? Basically, I wanted to create products that were even more eco-friendly than Body Shop, like all organic, only natural ingredients, that kind of thing. And you just see how that conversation is very smooth, is very natural, and it's very friendly and nice. So, in these types of conversations, don't make a presentation. It's like ping pong. You go back and forth between you and the other person, and no one dominates the conversation. So share the speaking time, but also this helps you because you're sharing the responsibility for continuing the conversation with the other person. Now, let's look at a specific little aspect of spoken English, and that's basically. So basically indicates that you're just summarizing, and you can put it in different positions in your sentence, like at the end. So I do a little bit of everything, basically. At the beginning, basically, I wanted to create my own products. Or in the middle, I'm basically in charge of creating the training programs. But you can put it in different places, and it just shows that you're, summarizing something that is maybe bigger or more complex idea. Now, it is very typical of spoken colloquial English. So some students ask, like, is it too informal? Do I sound too familiar if I use this a lot? No, it is neither formal nor informal. It does not change your message or the register, but it does add an element of natural spoken English to the way you speak. And if you listen to native speakers in natural conversations, you probably have heard this a lot from native speakers. Just listen for it and you'll hear it a lot. Now, let's have a look at some cultural insights all about Americans and awkward silence. So, we often hear about the expression awkward silence in small talk conversations. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google awkward silence. And you'll see that it is basically a silence between two people or more that is very uncomfortable for a lot of Americans. Not all Americans, I can't generalize about everyone, but very often it is uncomfortable because silence implies closeness. And if you've just met someone, like at a conference or at a networking event or some other kind of social event, you're probably not yet very close to them. And we often say that a friend is someone you can be silent with. So silence actually indicates this closeness with the person because you don't need to make polite small talk with your close friend. The silence in that situation is not so awkward. However, silence between maybe new colleagues or strangers can sometimes be quite uncomfortable for many Americans, and that's why they talk a lot. So, just some examples. If you are in these situations and you happen to be with an American, like you work with Americans, for example, or you're visiting an American company, or an American is visiting your company, they will probably try to start a conversation. If you're sitting together in the company cafeteria, at a table together, but you don't necessarily know each other, they'll start talking. If you're at the coffee machine or the water cooler, again, they will probably start some small talk conversation like in the picture, like, oh, nice weather today, huh? Yeah, it's really warm. You just have to play the game and try to make some conversation. If you are standing in line, if you've ever been to a supermarket in the US, maybe you've experienced this where Americans will just start talking to you just to, kill the time and to avoid that kind of awkward silence. If you're walking, maybe from the reception area to your office or to the meeting room, very common for them to just start talking about maybe the company, about the weather, about anything, but to try to, not have that silence during the walk from the reception to the meeting room, for example. So, for a lot of Americans, like I said, being together in the same space with a colleague or a new acquaintance, or sometimes even a stranger, that can be very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And that is why sometimes you're in the street and an American will come and talk to you and you think like, why is this person talking to me? What does he want? It's not dangerous. They don't want anything. They just maybe don't like the silence. Now, I know that in many cultures, this type of silence does not make people uncomfortable. And it's often a positive thing in a lot of cultures. But not in American culture. So don't be surprised when your American colleague or even a stranger tries to make conversation with you. It's totally normal. They're just avoiding that dreaded awkward silence. All right, so here's the recap on how to introduce yourself and make conversation. You can break the ice and be prepared to talk about the question, what do you do? Think ping pong conversation. Share the conversation. Share the responsibility for keeping the conversation going. You can use basically for summarizing in a very natural, colloquial way. And remember, many Americans just talk and make small talk to avoid awkward silence. Now, next lesson is going to be a very special presentation. I have something that I want to share with you. It's called American English Confident Conversation Skills, and we are going to look at that in the next lesson. But before we do that, I have a question for you, of course. What is one thing that you have difficulty doing in English conversations? Like, is it introducing yourself? Is it to know what information you can share with other people? To know what questions are appropriate? I don't know. Let me know. What is one thing that you have difficulty with in American conversations? And if you want to get the next lesson, go ahead and sign up at ChristinaRobuffet.com so that I can send it to you. And that is all for today's lesson. I'll see you next time, and thanks so much for learning with me. See ya.